No one in Genoa City was truly prepared for this kind of revenge, because the most terrifying thing about the wars between Victor and Jack has never been money, power, or even corporate destruction. It has always been Victor's ability to strike exactly where it hurts most and make his enemy collapse from the inside out. This time, he did not need a business scandal, a public humiliation in the boardroom, or an open threat. What he wanted was not a temporary defeat for Jack, but the complete destruction of Jack's pride, dignity, and the last fragile sense of peace he had fought to preserve in a life already marked by too many fractures. And to make that happen, Victor chose Patty, a woman who was both a ghost from Jack's past and a living wound that had never truly healed. For anyone else, she would have been too dangerous, too unstable, too unpredictable to trust. For Victor, she was the perfect weapon, because Patty was not only someone who had once loved Jack in an obsessive and distorted way, but also the living embodiment of every mistake, regret, and fear Jack had spent years trying to bury. The plan began in silence, cold and precise in a way that made it even more disturbing. Jack disappeared just long enough to create panic, but not long enough for the police to immediately recognize the pattern of a carefully orchestrated abduction. Clues were severed. His movements were erased. Blind spots were built into the timeline. Drugs, exhaustion, and disorientation left him waking up in an abandoned house on the outskirts of the city, a place that felt less like a prison and more like a psychological trap. Everything about it seemed designed to distort his sense of reality. The walls were old and damp. The air carried the smell of rotting wood. The wind slipped through cracks like whispers, and the weak yellow light made time feel slow, warped, and unreal. Jack was not tied up in the brutal, obvious way a hostage would expect. That false sense of freedom was what wore him down even more. He could walk a few steps. He could test a few doors. He could see the illusion of escape. But the more he tried to reclaim control, the more he realized he was trapped in a maze where even his own mind could no longer be trusted. Then Patty appeared, like a nightmare dragged out of memory and forced into flesh again. She was no longer the entirely chaotic woman people remembered from her darkest days. She entered that house with an eerie calm, almost gentle, almost tender, and that was far more frightening than open hysteria ever could have been. Because when someone with a shattered history becomes too quiet, too soft, too composed, it becomes impossible to tell where recovery ends and danger begins. Patty had been given the task of getting close to Jack, but Victor did not need to script every move. He only needed to build the right stage. Sealed off from the world, poisoned by old emotions, isolated enough for Patty to willingly step back into the obsession she had never truly escaped. She was both Victor's tool and a prisoner of her own fixation, because somewhere inside her still lived the part of her that had never accepted Jack's rejection, never accepted that in every version of life she imagined, she was never the woman he truly chose. Jack understood almost immediately that he was the target of something darker than a simple kidnapping, but understanding the trap did not mean he could escape it. What pushed him into a state of helplessness was not only Patty's presence, but the way everything around him was designed to erode his judgment. At times she was disturbingly gentle, bringing him food, speaking with a softness that sounded almost like care. Then, without warning, she shifted. She dragged the past into the room, reopened old wounds, and made him the center of every tragedy she had ever suffered. She did not have to restrain him with ropes because she was restraining him with guilt. Every look Patty gave him felt like an accusation. Every memory she revived forced Jack to confront the part of himself he hated most, the weak part, the selfish part, the man who had once believed he could step in and out of other people's emotions without leaving permanent damage behind. Inside that abandoned house, Jack was not only kidnapped from the outside world, he was dragged back into the darkest territory within himself. Back in Genoa City, Diane was the first to feel that something was terribly wrong. At first, she forced herself to cling to rational explanations, to believe that Jack's absence was temporary, harmless, or tied to some problem he had simply not explained yet. But the instincts of a woman who had been betrayed too many times could not be soothed for long. Each passing hour without word from him transformed her fear into something much sharper. It was no longer only the fear of losing her husband. It became a slow-burning rage toward every secret that seemed to haunt her life. Diane understood all too well that in Victor Newman's world, silence was rarely peace. More often, It was the warning sign of something calculated and cruel. Kyle was pulled into the search as well, but his reaction was different. Diane's fear came from emotional dread, from the sense that a personal catastrophe was unfolding. Kyle's anger came from the sickening realization that the Abbott family was once again being dragged into Victor's games simply to satisfy that man's endless need for control. His helplessness made him volatile, and that volatility reopened old fractures within the family. In the middle of the crisis, everyone believed they were fighting for Jack, but the way they fought only exposed the unresolved tensions already living beneath the surface. Nikki stood in the most painful position of all, because no one understood Victor's cruelty better than she did, and no one understood the horror of loving someone while also fearing what they were capable of more deeply than she did. At first, she tried to believe that Victor was merely playing some twisted, strategic game, some intimidation tactic that had gone too far. But the more the pieces came together, the more she realized that this time he had crossed a line that could never truly be explained away. What devastated Nikki was not only that Jack had become the target, but that Victor had been willing to pull someone as fragile and psychologically damaged as Patty into his revenge. That revealed something even darker than malice. It revealed the depth of Victor's addiction to power. When a man can look at another person's trauma, instability, and emotional ruin and see nothing but a useful instrument, he is no longer simply a difficult husband or a ruthless rival. He becomes a threat to everyone who still believes that love, family, and redemption mean anything at all. Inside the house, Patty's control began tightening in subtler and more dangerous ways. She did not try to overpower Jack immediately. She trapped him through ambiguity. There were moments when she made him believe she might be a victim too, that she was only following someone else's orders, that if he softened toward her, if he saw her as a wounded human being rather than a threat, they might both find a way out. That strategy was the most dangerous one of all, because it forced Jack into a constant state of conflict between caution and pity. He knew he could not let his guard down. He knew Patty was central to whatever had been done to him. But he also knew their past had left behind emotional distortions that were far too fragile to handle carelessly. One wrong gesture, one wrong expression, one wrong choice could trigger a spiral he might not be able to stop. Jack was pushed into a place where there were no clean choices left. If he stayed cold and resistant, Patty might break apart completely. If he softened, he risked becoming part of the very trap meant to destroy him. That was Victor's real cruelty. He did not simply want Jack to suffer. He wanted Jack to survive in a way that would leave him disgusted with himself afterward. The nightmare reached its most dangerous point when Patty began turning their isolation into a twisted imitation of love. She built a private fantasy in which she and Jack were not captor and captive, not victim and manipulator, but two people fate had forced back together. Every prolonged silence, every step too close, every touch loaded with memory, every attempt to blur past and present became part of the illusion Patty was creating. Jack resisted with reason, but reason was becoming harder to hold on to. Fatigue, fear, medication, shame, and emotional pressure had weakened him, and eventually, the line between survival and surrender became dangerously difficult to see. That was the shocking outcome Victor had wanted all along. Not just a scandal, not merely a humiliating image, but a moment in which Jack would be dragged to the lowest point of his own moral and emotional endurance, a point where no explanation afterward would ever sound clean enough to save him. When Diane finally traced the signs and came face to face with what had happened, the shock did not simply wound her as a wife. It struck the deepest fear she had never fully escaped. The fear that every attempt she had made to rebuild a life with Jack had been built on ground that could collapse at any moment. For Diane, betrayal was never just one act. It carried memory, humiliation, judgment, and all the years of being mistrusted, dismissed, and pushed aside. Looking at Jack in that situation, she no longer had enough emotional distance to separate victimhood from complicity. A wounded heart does not weigh evidence with perfect logic. It only sees the old wound being stabbed again in exactly the same place. That was why Diane's anger became so fierce, so bitter, and so devastating. It was directed at Patty, at Victor, and at Jack himself for allowing his life to be dragged into a situation powerful enough to destroy everything. And Jack, as the truth began to crawl into the light, was forced to face something even crueler than captivity itself: the look of horror and disappointment in the eyes of the woman he loved. He wanted to explain. He wanted to say he had been set up, that things were not what they looked like, that there had been moments when he was only trying to survive. But Jack also understood how weak those explanations sounded against the reality of what had been seen. Worse than that, he was not even sure he trusted himself completely anymore. He could no longer tell with full certainty which moments had been strategy, which had been panic, and which had been the beginning of an emotional collapse he never intended to allow. That contradiction tore him apart. One part of him wanted justice, wanted Victor exposed, wanted every layer of the plot dragged into the open. Another part of him was paralyzed by shame because he knew that some damage could not be repaired by the truth. Some images, once they enter the minds of the people closest to you, never fully leave. Victor, meanwhile, remained the cold center of the storm. He could deny details. He could avoid direct admission. He could twist the narrative into one more example of Jack's weakness. But deep down, he knew he had already won part of the war. Not because Jack was dead, and not because the Abbotts had been destroyed overnight, but because he had succeeded in poisoning trust between people who were already struggling to hold themselves together. That had always been Victor's preferred form of victory, the kind that did not only damage his enemy's status, but shattered their ability to believe in themselves. Yet that same cruelty also set something dangerous in motion. Nikki began to pull away from him with a level of disappointment that felt almost final. Diane turned pain into fury. Kyle stopped wanting to play by old rules. And Jack, the man Victor had dragged through humiliation and psychological ruin, was no longer likely to fight the way he once had. Because sometimes the most dangerous moment is not when a powerful man strikes first, but when the person he has destroyed realizes he has nothing left to lose. Jack had once tried to preserve his dignity, to believe he could oppose Victor with restraint, reason, and moral boundaries intact. But after this nightmare, something inside him had shifted. When a man is stripped of freedom, tortured with his own past, and turned into a weapon against his own life, whatever anger remains inside him is no longer the anger of a polished businessman trying to keep his composure. It becomes the rage of a man driven to the edge, a man whose dignity has been crushed, whose life has been rewritten by someone else's cruelty, and whose last remaining instinct may no longer be to survive honorably, but to strike back with the same darkness that was used against him. And in the world of the young and the restless, that is always the most dangerous turning point of all, because from the ashes of humiliation, only two things are usually born: total collapse or a retaliation so ruthless that no one will recognize the man who rises from it.